Real families, real farms, real food. Welcome to Arizona Agriculture Connection with Maricopa County Farm Bureau. My name is Nicole Clements, Executive Director, and I'll be your host. Maricopa County Farm Bureau is the voice of agriculture in a community that thrives on the dichotomy of urban and rural agriculture operations. This podcast is a home for farmers, ranchers, food lovers, prospective agriculturalists, and those looking to connect the food on their plate with the farm that it came from. As we take an inside look at agriculture in Arizona, we will delve into topics like ag technology, policy, food preparation, and everything in between. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform with new episodes every Wednesday. Arizona Agriculture Connection is hosted by Maricopa County Farm Bureau and sponsored by Paloma Ready Mix and Materials, a proud supporter of agriculture and our communities. Be sure to subscribe and share your favorite episodes with your friends. For more interactions, follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Maricopa County FB. Now let's discover some Arizona agriculture. Welcome back, Arizona Aggies. My name's Nicole, and welcome back to another episode of Arizona Agriculture Connection with Maricopa County Farm Bureau. I'm joined today by James O'Neill, Director of Legislative Affairs for the American Business Immigration Coalition. Welcome, James.
Hi, Nicole. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So today we're going to talk a little bit about our immigration workforce and how it's utilized and what we can do to help support that. Start off, tell us a little bit about your background and how you wound up at ABIC.
Yeah, so maybe I can first start with a little bit about what ABIC is. ABIC stands for the American Business Immigration Coalition. And so we are a national bipartisan coalition of over 1,800 CEOs, trade associations, chambers of commerce, retired CEOs, farmers, ranchers, across all sectors of the economy, all united to try and accomplish immigration reform that is morally right and also helps to grow the economy. I think the moment that we find ourselves in terms of the economic impact of immigration is that the U.S. Chamber says that if every single person on unemployment got a job today, there would still be about 1.7 million open jobs. And those are just jobs that are currently open and posted. That doesn't even account for jobs that would be open for businesses or farms that were looking to expand their operations. And so I think that's the primary thing that drives me to the work, is that I want to be there to support small businesses, to support small and medium-sized family farms. And the labor problem is one of the most significant limiting factors when it comes to the growth of those folks and their businesses and their operations. And so that's what brings me to the work, wanting to find solutions that allow our economy to continue to grow.
Absolutely. And there's so much that goes on with an immigration workforce. Obviously, it's heavily regulated, so there's a lot of paperwork and legalities that you have to abide by. And it can be just as confusing as doing your taxes, right? As anything is like that. So here in Arizona, agriculture tends to be a lot more hands-on with the different types of agriculture that we have, meaning it's a lot more manual labor intense. So if we were to lose that immigration workforce, what would that do? How would that affect our Arizona farmers?
I don't think I even need to say anything for farmers to understand what the impact would be, but maybe I can share a little bit of the data points. When it comes to agriculture nationwide, estimates range from between 40 and 60% of the agriculture labor force is undocumented. And so, farmers are doing their best to be compliant with the law, but that's what the data tells us, is that roughly half of the workforce lacks legal authorization. If you were to deport any sector of the economy, if you were to eliminate 50% of the workforce, the impact of that on the sector would be devastating. It would be absolutely devastating. And in terms of agriculture, there's a dual problem, which is that one, the high percentage of undocumented labor already in agriculture, and two, there is no domestic workforce that is looking to or interested in taking these jobs. And so if you got rid of 50% of the ag workforce without creating a new legal pathway for workers to be able to come in and do the work, American agriculture would collapse. One of two things would happen. Farmers would be forced to get out of farming and they would have to, sell their land and start doing something else, or they would have to change the nature of their operation to grow something that was a little less labor intensive because that might be more financially solvent for them. And so that fundamentally changes the agriculture sector if you get rid of half of the workforce. So it's almost an impossible question to answer because the impact would be so huge that we don't even know what the impact would be in terms of what we grow, how we grow it, what the supply would be. But on its face, though, if you were to cut ag goods supply by 50% because you've cut the workforce by 50%, demand from American consumers is not going to go down. Farmers know that demand has steadily increased over the course of US history. And so when you combine those two things, what that turns into is incredibly high grocery prices for consumers at the grocery store.
So when we think about the whole workforce and how that kind of applies on a daily basis, so there's a lot of regulation, which means there's a lot of paperwork and there's a lot of things that our farmers have to keep track of. And it can also change, and we may or may not, be aware of any of these changes. And it's a lot to keep up with. Kind of for the same reason that you would hire an accountant to do your taxes, what is the best resource available for the farmers out there to make sure that they have everything buttoned up and that it's being done properly?
Yeah, so in terms of making sure that you're following your rights and responsibilities as an employer, ABIC actually has been doing a series of trainings starting in November of last year called Employer Rights and Responsibilities. And so we've done some that are sector specific, focused on agriculture. We did one last week that was focused on the hospitality sector. We've done construction focused trainings as well. And so, please check out our website, which is abic.us. Where you can find future trainings, but these trainings cover a variety of topics. Primarily, they cover what your rights and responsibilities as an employer are when it comes to having an immigrant workforce. So first, how to make sure that you're completing your I-9 forms correctly, storing them properly, that you have all supporting documentation that you need stored with them, all of that kind of information, as well as how to have a plan in the event that, immigration actually shows up at your operation to do a raid, right? You want to be cooperating with law enforcement, but you also want to make sure that you're exercising your rights as an employer to make sure that your business is protected and make sure that your workforce is protected too. So those trainings that we offer cover both of those things, both on the paperwork side and on the sort of raid preparation side, how you can be prepared and how do you exercise your rights and how do you know what to do in the event that happens.
So in that event that something does happen, what is the first phone call we should be making? Or are we worried about that? Because we've got everything buttoned up and we know that. Is there some sort of notification process that we need to go through?
Yeah, I would definitely recommend being prepared no matter how locked down tight you think your paperwork is or your operation is. I know that any farmer can tell you when, regulators show up on the operation, there will always be something that they can find. And so, making sure that you are as tight as possible is important, but having a clear plan is also really important. Maybe I should rewind here and talk about, is this something that we're worried about? My answer, if I was a farmer, would be yes. I would be doing everything that I could to prepare for workplace enforcement. Workplace enforcement from Immigration and Customs Enforcement is going to come in two possible ways. One is an I-9 audit, which is where the federal government requests to see your Form I-9s and can then fine you for mistakes on those I-9s. And those can be very simple mistakes too. They can be a date was copied down wrong. In Hispanic cultures and in several other languages, you write the date as day first, then month, then year. In the United States and on our government forms, we write it as month first, day second, then year. And so something as simple as somebody filling it out the way that they're used to filling it out in their home country or in their home culture, that can be a substantive violation on an I-9 form when an agent looks at it. And so all of those little tiny things can add up when all of those fines get added up. And so that's something that I'd be very concerned with as a farmer. The second thing that enforcement can look like is a worksite raid, and that can be ICE agents showing up at your operation looking to detain folks that they suspect of being here without proper authorization. And like I said, you can be a farmer that is doing everything right, that has looked at all of the documents presented to them, filled out all the paperwork 100% correctly. And as I mentioned, the data tells us that it's about half of the workforce. And so you may have unauthorized folks working on your farm without ever knowing it and without ever being at fault for you knowing it. And so protecting your workforce and protecting your business goes along with making sure that you have a plan on how to respond to these two different types of enforcement as they happen.
So, and maybe backing up, we should have maybe started with this, but so there's different kinds of immigration labor, right? So, you might have heard in the news. So we've got H-2A, H-2B. What are some just key differences about those different sectors and how they operate on the farms?
Yeah, so there are three primary guest worker visa programs that exist. Only one out of those three guest worker programs is for agriculture work, and that's the H-2A program. However, I do know that there are some farm adjacent tasks or construction at the farm tasks that may be covered by H-2B work. The third option is H-1B. H-1Bs are primarily used by like engineering companies or high-tech firms or Silicon Valley firms. Those are for individuals that have jobs that are high education requirements. So those are college degree required type of jobs. 2B, as I mentioned, that's for seasonal work, but that's for seasonal non-agriculture work only. And then the last one is the H-2A program, which is for agriculture work, but seasonal agriculture work only. And so there are a lot of H-2As being used by the agriculture sector now. We're actually on pace to have a record number of H-2A visas issued this year. And I say that because the H-2A program was designed to be a program of last resort for farmers. It was never intended to be a primary source of labor. However, the domestic market for labor in the US has essentially become non existent. I have heard of a farmer in Wisconsin, a dairy farmer who started offering $30 an hour for milkers at her farm, which was her operating outside of her margins. That was her operating at a loss for the sale of her milk. She had one domestic worker show up for 2 days and then quit because the work was too hard. And so we have seen the domestic labor pool for ag work essentially evaporate. It doesn't exist anymore. And so that's driving more and more farmers to be forced to use the H-2A program. On top of that, we also have a situation where more and more farmers, as they become more sophisticated and are doing more year-round operations or are adding in different rotations to make sure that they can be operating year-round so that they're increasing their margins as much as possible so that they can stay afloat, the labor need has gone up. So you have more labor need than ever on top of a program that is meant to be a last resort program, on top of the fact that some sectors and subsectors in ag can't even use H-2A, like dairy does year-round production. And more year-round production operations mean more and more operations that are ineligible to apply for H-2A workers. And so that's sort of the exact problem that has led us to this. Around 50% of our farm workers are undocumented. It is a policy failure in Washington that's the situation we find ourselves in.
So I think you touched on a little bit there. One of the big messages that I see in the media coming from Americans is that we should be using our domestic labor force first before we go to an immigration workforce. But you kind of touched on it there earlier. The problem is they're not willing to take those jobs. And if we have, so many open jobs, and if we fill every single one of those off of the unemployment numbers, and we still have over 1 million jobs open, there's some point where we're going to have to, consider that immigration workforce is essential to us as a country.
Yeah, you're exactly right. What we have is a numbers problem. And when I was describing those H visa programs, one thing that I didn't mention specifically is that all of those visa programs actually have domestic workforce protections built into them. So, for example, the H-1B that I mentioned, in order to hire an H-1B visa recipient, you have to publish a job posting for a certain amount of time, and then you have to show the Department of Labor all of the job submissions that you've received for that position, and either show we didn't receive sufficient numbers of job applications, or the few applications that we did get were not qualified because they didn't actually have the degree that is required to do this technical job. And so that visa program has a very clear domestic workforce production. You have to try and hire a domestic worker first before you're even eligible to apply for an H-1B. And then on the H-2B and the H-2A, there are wage protections built in for domestic workers too. First of all, as I'm sure any farmer that uses H-2A knows, there's the AWER, or the adverse effect wage rate, which is incredibly high and continues to rise every year. We see somewhere between, I have seen single year jumps as high as 12% in some regions of the AWER, but typically they're somewhere between 3 and 8% year over year for wages that the farmer is required to pay for H-2A workers. And that is designed to make sure that somebody isn't choosing to hire immigrant labor for cheaper instead of hiring domestic labor. It is more expensive to use the H-2A program than it is to hire a domestic worker. Because of that AWER, they're paid the same amount, on top of the fact that a farmer has to reimburse an H-2A worker for their travel from their home country in order to get to the job site. And that farmer also has to pay for and maintain housing for that guest worker to be here too. So all of these programs are built in such a way that it makes it easier, cheaper, and preferential for an American employer to hire domestic labor. Like I mentioned, that's why H-2A is a program of last resort for farmers. But because there is no domestic workforce for agriculture, more and more farmers are being forced to use this program because there is no alternative. There is no other labor source that they could be hiring. I say that in the sense that it's almost comical to me when I hear someone say, immigrants are coming to take our jobs. I almost have to laugh at hearing that, because the jobs that immigrants are generally coming to the US to do are jobs that there is no domestic labor market for. There is nobody that is already here that is even interested in doing that work. And that's why we have to be bringing in guest workers to fill those critical gaps.
I think that's another argument that we see a lot, is that they're underpaid and that they're doing this, backbreaking manual labor for $5 an hour or something ridiculous, which is just not the case.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Like I mentioned, there are domestic worker protections both on the hiring side to make sure it's always easier for a farmer or an employer to hire domestic workers, and on the wage side. So farmers are not hiring immigrant labor because it's cheaper. They're hiring immigrant labor because those are the only people applying for the jobs.
So when we think about, kind of speaking to that messaging that we see a lot of times in the media, online, and a lot of discussions that are happening, especially when there's a lot of talk regarding the regulation around these programs. So how critical is it for us to continue the advocacy from an agriculture side for immigration workforce programs?
Again, I think that I don't have to say this for any farmer in your county, but it is absolutely critical. This is, the labor shortage problem represents, in my opinion, at least, a pretty existential threat for a lot of farms out there. If the cost of labor continues to rise because more and more folks are having to use this program of last resort without having it be reformed, like I said, folks are going to get out of farming, or they're going to sell their land and move on to something else, or take an early retirement, or whatever other options are available to folks, or they're going to start growing something that's a lot less labor intensive. So all of that to say, like, this is an existential threat for farmers, and I think that our representatives and leaders in Washington need to understand that clearly. I think any framework for solving this problem has to involve protections for the existing workforce, for the folks that are already here and working in agriculture, the folks that have been working and paying taxes for multiple years, the folks that have showed a commitment to working in agriculture, the folks that don't have a criminal record. Those folks need to be able to stay long term and have, proper work authorization and be able to get a work permit so that they can go to work without having to look over their shoulder. And I think any reasonable solution to this problem also has to include reforms to our guest worker programs that make it cheaper, easier, more streamlined, and more available and expanded in terms of its eligibility for farms to be able to get new guest workers in to do the jobs that, frankly, Americans just don't want to do. There's no appetite for them to do. And so I think those two policy pieces are absolutely critical to making sure that farmers have adequate workforce. And as I mentioned before, when farmers have adequate workforce, that drops grocery prices for consumers. When farmers are able to keep up with and meet the demand in terms of being able to supply the demand that exists in the US, that leads to lower prices for consumers. So not only is this an existential threat for farmers, but any listeners that are maybe not farmers themselves, or maybe not farm operators or ranchers, but who go to the grocery store to get their food, this is a threat to you as well, right? Making sure that the agriculture sector is fully staffed, that not only agriculture, but then other industries, other sectors like manufacturing and meat packing, they're fully staffed to be able to keep up with demand. All of that leads to lower grocery prices for you as a consumer at the grocery store.
I think that, we saw a little bit of that in the news from the California side about citrus harvest. So if the labor's not there to harvest the product, then that puts you in a typical supply and demand. There's less supply, there's the same demand, so your prices are higher. So there's that aspect of it. And I know for a lot of our dairy farmers in Maricopa County, the dairy operations are 24/7, 365. So the cows don't stop making milk just because the labor didn't show up, right? And at that point, now we're looking at a herd health issue because we still have to take care of the same number of cows with half of the labor or, whatever that picture may look like. But there's a lot of issues when we think about pulling out this labor force that we have in agriculture. Now you're just creating this domino effect of issues that will keep compounding, and it's only going to end up at the consumer store at prices.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think one more thing that I'd like to say about the example you gave of the citrus farmers in California is part of the problem with that was increased immigration enforcement in the area meant that a lot of farmers weren't showing up to work because they were scared. And so I think that also points me towards what we were talking about early in terms of preparation. If you want to make sure that your workforce is feeling prepared and feeling confident to be able to continue coming to work, making sure that you have a plan as a farm and that you communicate that plan with your staff of, if ICE comes to our operation, this is how we're going to act, this is how we're going to behave, and this is how I as a farmer am going to try and protect you. All of that is critically important to making sure that your workforce feels confident enough to continue to show up and do the work that you as a farmer rely on them to do. But you're exactly right on the flip side of that too, in terms of the consumer. If you don't have the labor, a couple of years ago, there was an asparagus farmer in Idaho, and he went through the process. He got his H-2A workers. He had a legal workforce. Those workers got held up at the border by just a couple of days. But those couple of days were a big enough difference that he missed his harvest window for his asparagus, and an entire year's crop of asparagus, I think it was $350,000 worth of asparagus, ended up going to waste. He offered, local community kitchens and food pantries to come and pick it as a donation, but that was only because he didn't have any other options either. He lost an entire year's profit from that crop just because of the labor that was missing. So, we're talking about impact, we're talking about being prepared, we're talking about making sure that folks are there to do the work that we need them to do. That speaks to the impact that failing to solve this problem can have too. There will be more crops that go unpicked. There will be more citrus that goes unpicked in California. There'll be more asparagus in Idaho that goes unpicked. There'll be more apples in Washington that go unpicked. There'll be more tomatoes in Florida that go unpicked, and so on and so on and so on. All of these labor intensive crops and all of these labor intensive, livestock production and animal byproducts that we have are all going to become a lot more difficult with an even stricter labor market, all of which raises prices for consumers.
Backstepping just a minute back to our farmers making sure that their workforce is confident coming to work every day, right? So you have some of those resources, and we'll throw those on the website and in the show notes, links to the ABIC website and the resources that they have. Because a lot of times the farmer, they may have someone, and that is their full-time job is to handle their labor and workforce. Some of our operations aren't quite that big. Maybe they don't have somebody. As a farmer, you're trying to do all things, which makes it a lot harder to be 1,000% accurate on everything, right? So we want to make sure that we have enough resources out there that are available to provide for our farmers to make sure that they have everything that they need information-wise. And as always, if there are any questions, they can reach out to ABIC.
Yeah,
To you.
absolutely. I'm happy to be a resource. Feel free to include my email address in all of the resources that you share out, and folks can feel free to reach out.
Fantastic. I want to switch gears just a little bit, talk a little bit more about the advocacy side and what ABIC is doing. I know, we've talked briefly about the councils of 100 and that sort of thing. So, what are your goals from an advocacy standpoint as an organization?
Yeah, our goal is to be able to push back against anti-farmer and anti-business proposals as they relate to immigration and the workforce. And I think that if I could leave one note or one message to the farmers that are listening, is that, it takes a lot of courage, but there is great courage in pushing back against policies that are bad for farmers, whether it's a water use policy that restricts your ability to continue to produce, whether it's a labor policy that restricts your ability to survive and stay competitive. Whoever is responsible for that policy, I think it's critical that we push back against the things that make life more difficult for farmers. I myself am not a farmer, but I love to eat. And so I am also interested in pushing back against anti-farm or anti-farmer policies, which is another reason, that I'm involved in this work. But yeah, as you mentioned, one of the things that we're doing in order to be able to push back against anti-farmer, anti-business labor policies are building these councils of 100. So we have councils of business owners, of farmers or ranchers that are being built, that are active with each other, engaging with each other to talk about how these changes in policy are impacting their sector of the economy and how best to respond to them. So we have sectors for hospitality, construction. We have a council that is just for chambers of commerce throughout the country, and we also have an agriculture sector. And so I will also, offer to anybody listening, if they'd like to be engaged with us on the Ag Council of 100, we'd be happy to have you. I'll include like sign up materials in all of the stuff that Nicole can put onto the website and the show notes and all that kind of stuff. So we would love to have you involved. As I mentioned, what we're looking to fight for as a Council of 100 is legislation that does those two things I mentioned earlier: protects the existing workforce, those without criminal records, who have been working and paying taxes, who've shown a commitment to working in agriculture, and two, reforming the guest worker program so that more farmers are eligible to use it, and it's easier, cheaper, and more streamlined for farmers to use, considering how many farmers are already using it.
Yeah, I think it's a great mission, and it's a big lift for you guys, but I know a lot of our farmers really appreciate everything you do, and if we can help in any way, we would like to do that. But I want to thank you so much for joining us today. This was a wealth of information. Thank you for taking the time and for sharing with us and for continuing to be a resource and an advocate for our farmers and their workers.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm a little bit of a nerd when it comes to this kind of stuff, so I always enjoy talking about it. And, I appreciate you saying that there are folks in your organization that value the work that we do. as I already said, I love to eat. And so I value the work that farmers do far more than the work that I do. I wouldn't be able to do the work that I do if there weren't farmers doing the lot more difficult stuff that they do day in and day out. And so I appreciate your listeners as well.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. Again, I will put James' email and all of their resources on our website and in the show notes. And as always, you can sign up for our newsletter where the information will be available as well. So thank you, James, for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in today to another episode of Arizona Agriculture Connection. Be sure to catch a new episode every Wednesday wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for tuning in today, and remember, Farm Bureau has a place for you. Be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with your friends on socials. You can also visit our website, maricopacountyfb.org, for more information and to submit a topic you want to learn about. Remember to tune in every Wednesday wherever you listen to podcasts. A huge thank you to Paloma Ready Mix and Materials for supporting our agriculture producers and this podcast. Maricopa County Farm Bureau, bringing you the stories of real families, real farms, and real food. I'm Nicole Clements, signing off. Catch you next week.